First presentation on the Vikings. You just have to use a space bar. Okay, there you go.
So, my chapter was about pagans and Christians and about how Christianity sort of influenced the Vikings in a way. But the major stereotype that the Vikings rest upon aggressive paganism.
I love that show. Sorry.
Yeah, I haven't watched it yet, but I'll start pretty soon.
Yeah, it's called The Vikings.
Yeah. Vikings did...
It's a comedy on Netflix. No.
Vikings did attack monasteries because it was easy loot. Christians believed that it was explicitly because they were Christians. Yet I remember watching the video with John Green and said that most of the Christian writings about Vikings can be inaccurate because of the basically being biased. Yet the Vikings did have good taste in art. In the 21st century, Western society generally distinguished between applied art, pure art, and artistic endeavor. Is separated off from the everyday world. All Viking art was applied art and has sometimes been regarded as decoration of functional objects. Archaeologists such as Bjorn Mir saw art styles in terms of ethnic symbols and identities that were used in deliberate expression of Vikingness. Others have focused on possible ideological meanings of motifs. For example, animal ornament may represent part of totemic belief system, and it's important to remember that our knowledge of Viking depends on durable objects of metal and stone. Their religion. So they believed in basic classes, two families of gods, the Aesir, including Odin and Thor, and Vanir, including Jord, Freya, yeah. There were also servants of gods, such as the Valkyries and Odin's raven, as well as giants, dwarves, trolls, ghosts, and so on. So it kind of reminded me of The Hobbit mixed with sorcery and the practice of seer was fundamental to the Viking belief. Didn't really expand much after that, but for grave burials, a grave in the cemetery at the Danish Ring at Franket has been interpreted as the burial of a witch or sorceress. Buried the dead fully clothed with personal ornaments, together with a selection of utensils of everyday life, could be cremated or just a regular burial. These burials were more common in Norway and eastern and central Sweden, rare in Denmark. When cremated, they could be placed directly into a pit, put into a bag, pottery, or metal vessel, or spread around the ground. Scandinavian belief systems in Christian religion, it appears that conversion was as much a process of developing new approaches to the ideology as dealing with a clash of religions. So it took a little, it was a span of time before they converted them, or had a little bit more influence on them. Conversion took place under royal direction, first in Denmark in 965, later in Norway 995, finally in Sweden in 1008. Research has indicated that Christianization was a long process. Initial contact occurred because of Christian missions. Recorded that in 829, King Severe in eastern Sweden asked, Frankish Emperor Louis the Pious for a missionary to visit his country, as many wanted to adopt the Christian faith. Women in pre-Christianity, women played an important role in pre-Christian Scandinavian religion, although some argue that they didn't have much of a role. But because there was no women, no Christian goddess, religious practice was officiated over by men. So those are certain reasons why. But Sophie Graslund. She's an archaeologist, and she disagrees because women weren't shunned until later, so their voices were heard in the beginning until years passed. Majority of men, I believe, made tating were jugs, and women had a key role in dedicating rune stones. Burials, the burials continue. Cremation was prohibited by the early church as a pagan practice. It declined during the 10th century, although in some areas it continued. During the 9th and 10th, all graves were cremations. No indications of any Christian influence from Burqa. In 950, the inhumation rite was introduced, but cremation continued to be used in parallel until the mid-12th century. This sort of shows the influence of Christianity, but there were still pagan elements. Grave goods, Thor's hammer, amulets, and food offerings. The rune stone, introduced in 10th century, emphasizes that Christianization was a long, drawn-out process. Churches, it was believed that Ansgar established a church in Burqa in the 9th century. Archaeology belongs to the 10th, shows that belonged in the 10th, 11th century. They built wooden churches in the 11th century, and an explosion of stone churches were built in the 12th and 13th century. So the influence of Christianity sort of came throughout, but they still had certain beliefs within their first initial religion. And that is it.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's a good introduction. So we're going to move on to our next presentation.
All right, so I actually had chapter 2. All right, so early Scandinavian. So to understand the Viking Age, it's necessary to start with the Scandinavian and to examine the changes that were taking place from the 8th century and for and continuously or whatever. So Scandinavia covers 12% of the total European landmass, but its population makes up only 3% of the European total, and the great expanses of the interior have always been sparsely populated. The modern Scandinavian countries did not exist at the start of the Viking Age. The kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon England and continental Europe had accepted the Christian view of the king as God's prime servant on earth, but this is not the case in Scandinavian. The societies there maintained their old structures of tribes, each dominated by a numerous aristocracy and temporarily ruled by chieftain. By 1200, each Scandinavian country was established as a nation state according to the Western European pattern. And just to give the book goes into details with Norway, Sweden, Denmark, but also they mentioned Finland. I know Iceland as well was one of the countries as well. So the Viking Age is seen as a period during which these countries, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and then generally seen as, including Finland, acquired their national identities. Since there is very little written documentation, the dating of archaeological evidence for these early state societies has considerable significance. So Denmark took its name from its people, the Danes. Its southern frontier lay at the foot of the Jutland Peninsula in what is now North Germany. During the Viking Age, much of Denmark was extensively wooded with oak and beech, although there was also sand dunes and heath. The name Denmark is first used by Wolfton, an Archbishop of York, and from the mid-10th century, we know of a continuous succession of kings, beginning with Gorm the Old, and then royal power was extended under his son, Harald Bluetooth, who conquered Norway in the early 960s. And then Norway took its name from the shelter sea route down its western coast, the Norvergor, or Northway. Northway was first unified in the 80s by Harald Finehair, king of Vestfold, which included southern Norway and then the coastal districts. Norway shared a border with Sweden and also a short stretch with Denmark, but difficulties of land communication meant that the population looked natural to the sea. And then the first recorded Viking raiders in the British Isles were probably from Hordaland in Western Norway. That's what they mentioned in the book. And then Sweden was like the last country that they even spoke about, or went into details about. But Sweden took its name from the Severe people in central Sweden. Its modern boundaries incorporate a varied landscape with wide variations in soil, climate, and relief. Southern Sweden had a coastal climate. The north had very cold winters and with much ice and snow. And the coniferous forest still covers 50% of the landmass, which provides opportunities for hunting and fishing during the Viking Age. And the international trade was developed in the Baltic with links south to Byzantium. And in Swedish Vikings tended to look eastwards, but several joined expeditions of the west to England and Normandy. And like the way that the book concludes that is just Scandinavian has always been on the fringes of Europe, not just geographically, but culturally as well. Despite differences, the Scandinavian peoples were united by proximity to the sea, and this has helped foster a sense of transnational identity. And this emerged for the first time during the Viking Age. That's all.
All right. Thank you very much.
For the Viking paper we have to write, how long do you want